Before I dive in, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone that watched and liked and commented on my last video on the Rolling Stones Top 500 Albums and subscribed to my channel. You all gave me my first 1,000 view video and my first big bump in subs, and I hope you all enjoy what's to come. I've got some cool stuff planned, so once again, thank you so much for your support. In that last video, I talked a lot about the Beatles, naturally because they're on that list a lot, and it got me thinking, what actually is the best Beatles album? They're one of my all-time favorite bands, and I've never actually ranked all the albums worst to best. Now, I think we could all argue about this till the end of time, and really there's no wrong answer. Well, actually, we'll get to that. This list was really hard to make. I change my mind about my favorite Beatles album about every 10 years. They're all that good. So I reserve the right to make another one of these videos in a decade or so. Also, just a disclaimer, these are just covering the canonical UK Beatles albums, no American releases or ones exclusive to other countries. Also, no comps or remix albums or anthologies or anything released after the band broke up. This is strictly the OG albums released between 1963 to 1970, the core catalog. We'd be here all day otherwise. But if you're a completist and you want a great compilation of all those loose singles the Beatles released in addition to their albums, I recommend Past Masters, Volumes 1 and 2. Okay, here we go. First up, at number 13, Yellow Submarine. I think for any Beatles expert, the fact that this is dead last is pretty obvious. The soundtrack to their late era animated children's film, which they didn't even provide the voices for, by the way, isn't even fully a Beatles album. The second half is just scores for the film from producer George Martin. The front half contains undeniable classics like Hey Bulldog, but it also contains All Together Now, which is a footnote I think most of us are okay with hitting the skip button on. Next up at number 12 is Beetles For Sale. When you compare this one to other early Beatles albums, this one sounds a bit half-baked, and that's because, well, it was. Simply put, the guys were tired from the constant touring, TV appearances, and late-night studio sessions. At the height of Beatlemania, the lads from Liverpool were put through the ringer, living a very chaotic, very public life. So when the record label gave them a strict deadline for the next album, they threw this together, featuring some covers and some deep-cut originals that people don't really talk about nowadays. There's still some gems here, of course. This is a Beatles album we're talking about. No Reply, 8 Days a Week, What You're Doing, I'll Follow the Sun, their cover of rock and roll music. But the title Beatles For Sale really kind of says it all, doesn't it? At this point, the Beatles were a commodity, churning product, and they would soon get pretty sick of that. Next up, Let It Be at number 11. Okay, we've reached the point where every album from here on out is a certified hood classic. They only get better and better from here on out. Having said that, I'm sure a lot of people are scratching their heads why this one's so low on the list, and my answer for that is simple. Because it's usually pretty overrated. It's technically an unfinished album that was released anyway without much collective input from the band. The legend surrounding Let It Be has to do with the infamous Get Back sessions, the failed experiment of basically creating an album in front of cameras like a reality television show and then scrapping the whole thing and just playing a set on the rooftop of the Apple building. Egos were inflamed, tensions were high, apathy was in full force, and the album was shelved until a year later when Phil Spector threw a bunch of strings on it, and it was released as the final proper Beatles album. But it just goes to show, even when the band weren't firing on all cylinders, they made absolute classics, like Dig a Pony, Across the Universe, the title track, I've Got a Feeling, and Get Back, among others. At number 10 is With the Beatles. This is the one that made them superstars, and rightly so. With the Beatles kicked off the cultural phenomenon known as Beatlemania, with a collection of high-energy covers and a few originals that were already showing Lennon and McCartney's songwriting chops. Did I mention this thing is high energy? From the up-tempo call and response Yaz in It Won't Be Long,
It won't be long, yeah, yeah, yeah.
to the infectious Paul original All My Lovin', to their nothing but fun rendition of Money, That's What I Want, the boys sound like they're having nothing but fun in the studio. And it translated well to boomer teenagers record players in 1963. And that energy still shines through today on laptop speakers, albeit in a remastered version. At number 9 is Help. The Beatles were pretty checked out from the proceedings, smoking weed all the time on the set of their second film, Help. But in the studio for the soundtrack, they were making big creative moves. This is the beginning of the transition from the Mop Tops era to being more influenced by their contemporaries in Dylan and the Beach Boys. Take one listen to the John originals on here, like Ticket to Ride, Help, and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, and you can hear the transition happening that would come full force only one album later. Also, I think this one contains my favorite Ringo cover song moment when he does a faithful rendition of Act Naturally by Buck Owens. Classic. This one might surprise some people. At number 8, I have Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And this one's come under a significant amount of reevaluation over the years, but not by me. Sorry. This was never one of my favorite Beatles albums. Everyone who was alive in 1967 will gladly tell you Sgt. Pepper was a moment, a pivotal creation that basically established the idea of the concept album and cemented the Beatles' legacy as the most important band of a generation. That it contains their finest compositions like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life. And listen, Sgt. Pepper is marvelous. I don't have to tell you. If you've heard it, you know. But I would argue that because of its reliance on sounds from the time, that is the summer of love and the peak of psychedelic influence in popular music, parts of this album have not aged as well as other Beatles moments. This has constantly been lauded as a perfect album, and it's not. It's close, but it's not. Of course, that's up for debate, so let me have it in the comments below. But if there's anything overlooked about Sgt. Pepper, however, it's George Harrison's contribution, Within You, Without You, which is a blissful, sitar-based contribution that people just don't talk about enough. Okay, number 7 is A Hard Day's Night. This is the finest moment for the Fab Four, if we're talking in terms of their filmmaking. A Hard Day's Night is an iconic movie, and the way the movie and its accompanying album capture the heyday of Beatlemania is a time capsule that will be studied for basically forever. This album is also notable for being the first one that contains no covers. All the songs were written by John and Paul. And from the title track to Can't Buy Me Love and everything in between, the whole thing is pure enthusiasm, pure joy. The Beatles were on top of the world in 1964, and at this point in time, it really sounds like they were enjoying themselves. Number 6, Rubber Soul. While Dylan was going electric, the Beatles were going Dylan. That's a bit of an oversimplification. There's a lot going on with Rubber Soul, but all of it was a new direction for the band. George was getting into Eastern music. You can hear his contribution in John's Norwegian Wood, the first pop song ever to use a sitar. If A Hard Day's Night captured the infectious enthusiasm of the Beatles bursting onto the scene, then Rubber Soul was the moment when the group settled into their fame and began to respond to the trends around them with their own contribution. It's more introspective, more thoughtful. It introduced a growing, more intelligent Beatles. The band was growing up with their audience, and with the 1960s, which were also becoming less innocent. Please Please Me is at number 5. This one ranks so high for me personally because it's the very first Beatles album I ever heard. I was 3 years old, and I listened to my dad's CD copy, and from Paul's count-off on I Saw Her Standing There, I was hooked.
1, 2, 3.
Obviously, the group sounds unpolished, raw, full of energy. The whole thing feels like a live album. And it basically is. That was intentional on George Martin's part. They recorded the whole album in 13 hours. And by the time we get to Twist and Shout, John's voice is completely shot. He could only do 2 takes for that song. The Beatles would get better in the studio, and they would get a lot more time to do so. Hello, Sgt. Pepper. But in those early days, this marathon session captured on tape is probably the closest they ever got in the studio to recapturing the manic energy of their Cavern Club shows. Number 4, Abbey Road. The very last music the Beatles ever recorded together, and their true final album. If we ignore the fact that Maxwell's Silver Hammer is a thing, this is basically every member of the Beatles firing on all cylinders. John gave us Come Together and Because and I Want You, She's So Heavy. Paul gave us a whole medley of classics on side 2. George gave us his 2 best Beatles contributions, Something and Here Comes the Sun. And even Ringo gave us a banger on here with Octopus's Garden. It's sad the Beatles had to go so soon because we all know at this point they were not the best of friends. But they definitely went out on a high note, which is the understatement of the century. When you put these 4 in a room and the goal was just to make music, all the other nonsense went away. And maybe the best example of that is Abbey Road. At number 3, Magical Mystery Tour. I know what you're thinking. Number 3? Really? This high? Yes, I stand by it. Because while we all know Magical Mystery Tour, the movie, was not the brightest moment in the Beatles film canon, the soundtrack is so good. In my opinion, the most underrated album of the band's entire catalog. Let me put it to you this way. When you're a young kid, Mop Top Beatles is your thing. When you get to high school, you graduate to Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road. When you hit college, when you start really, let's call it expanding your mind, if you know what I mean, that's when you listen to this one. This is the era of weird Beatles. From George Harrison's Blue Jay Way to Lennon's I Am the Walrus to the untouchable 1-2 punch of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. This is seen as the album where the Fab Four lost the plot. Their manager Brian Epstein had just died, and the group were diverging creatively, but Magical Mystery Tour proves that even at their most lost and confused and frankly strung out, the Beatles were still making absolute jams. Coming in at number 2, Revolver. A radical departure wouldn't do this album justice. Fed up with touring and choosing to be solely a studio band, the Beatles gave it their all on Revolver, which was the ultimate turning point for this group. Revolver went in 100% on the things that Rubber Soul only hinted at. One listen to Paul's Eleanor Rigby, George's Taxman, and John Lennon's And Your Bird Can Sing, and you won't believe this was only 2 years after A Hard Day's Night. This is where we really start to see each member doing their own thing. Paul's getting into orchestral compositions, John's leaning into loud guitar sounds and studio experimentation, and George is deep into Eastern spirituality and the sounds associated with that. All the sounds here are fresh and fun to listen to. There's never a dull moment on Revolver. The whole thing leaves you guessing from front to back. John's Tomorrow Never Knows, the best song on the album, uses tape loops and is highly influential in the act of sampling and electronic music. This was the one that changed everything. For the Beatles, for music, it's brilliant and still a thrill to listen to even a half century later. And my pick for the number 1 best Beatles album, the White Album. Double albums are always fascinating to me. They're always bloated, always fabulously flawed. A good double album is unpredictable. It twists and turns with each new song. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing what sticks. Ultimately, the highs are high and the lows are maybe the lowest point of the band's entire career. With the Beatles' White Album, that's kind of true, but since it's the Beatles we're talking about here, the lows aren't really that low, they're actually great. I don't really think the White Album has one skippable song, and that's quite a feat for a double album. At this point, after the immaculate Sgt. Pepper and the perceived misfire of Magical Mystery Tour, creative tensions were rising within the 3 primary songwriters, and basically every Beatle was working alone in his own wing of the studio. The result is this messy, sprawling, brilliant album that combines all the best and less than best ideas from everyone. The White Album is basically a Beatles Rorschach test. Everyone has a strong opinion on what they're hearing. What songs should have been left on the cutting room floor? What songs should remain on the album? What the best and worst moments are? So what is the best song? Is it Dear Prudence? While My Guitar Gently Weeps? Julia? What's the worst song? Obla Di Obla Da? Bungalow Bill? Savoy Truffle? Wild Honey Pie? It's Wild Honey Pie. There's so many roads and detours you can take with this album, and a lot of artists and bands have done just that. The White Album is one of the most influential pieces of art of all time. It's omnivorous, it contains multitudes. It has Tin Pan Alley, folk, doo-wop, psych, proto-heavy metal. It's maybe the first album ever that invites the listener to edit, to collaborate, to continue the conversation. Is it the blank canvas for the album art that inspires this? Is it the scattershot and eccentric playlist? The fact that it's intentionally incoherent? The opposite of a statement, the anti-Sgt. Pepper? I'm not sure, but I absolutely adore it. Some would love nothing more than to trim the album to their favorites and make it a perfect single album, but I can't do that. To that I say, if you take even 1 second out of this beautiful mess of an album, it would no longer be the White Album. Pick another color, but it's not white. The White Album is a perfect soundtrack to the time it was made, specifically the year 1968, when the decade was unraveling into social unrest and protest, and the Beatles themselves were growing apart. In a schizophrenic state, the album vacillates between grand statements to pure nonsense, as if to say with an aggressive shrug, what the hell is going on in the world today? For that alone, it's as relevant of a listen as it was 50 years ago. Okay, there you go, we made it. So some of those takes are coming in pretty hot, so if you love or hate my rankings for the Beatles albums best to worst, please let me know in the comments below. Also, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'm on social media stuff. You can follow me there as well. That's all linked below in the description. I'm Ben, the Playlist Fiend, and thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.